Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Miriam Margles. I'm a member of the senior core faculty at IJS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our special program featuring Rabbi Josh Fagelson in conversation with Rabbi Shai held. Before we begin, I want to call your attention to several upcoming opportunities with IJS to nurture and deepen your personal relationship to Jewish spiritual practice in the company of a community of practice. Our daily Jewish meditation sits are held Monday through Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Zoom, free of charge. We offer a monthly meditation sit led by and for LGBTQ plus folks, and a monthly sit led by and for Jews of color. These are also free of charge. Beginning this week is a 7-week course called God is Here, Reimagining the Divine. Rabbi Toba Spitzer will guide you in an exploration of diverse metaphors for the divine in Jewish tradition. It's not too late to join Awareness in Action for the Omer, taught by Rabbi Mark Margolius and guest instructors. Join IJS for this 10-week program of Tikkun Midot, the growing and strengthening of our innate spiritual character traits. On May 15th, Josh will be in conversation with Rabbi Sharon Brous about her new book, The Amen Effect. We'll be in touch when registration is open for this event. And finally, we're very excited to announce that our 4th annual Evening of Gratitude will take place on June 4th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Zoom. Marking the 30th anniversary of the groundbreaking book, The Jew in the Lotus, IJS will be convening the book's author, Roger Kamenetz, along with author and teacher Jay Michelson, in conversation with journalist and educator Jane Eisner. We hope you'll join us for what is sure to be a thought-provoking and engaging conversation. You'll receive more information in your inbox soon. For now, please save the date, June 4th. For details about these and other programs, I encourage you to check out our website. The link is in the chat. And a note before we begin. In the context of the profound challenges we are facing right now, our work, cultivating Jewish mindfulness and resilience, healing and wisdom, is more important than ever. We count on support from people like you to be able to offer programs like tonight's gathering and to continue to reach wider audiences and to deepen our impact. If you are moved to do so, please consider making a donation of any amount. The link is in the chat, or you can go to our website's donation page at jewishspirituality.org. Thank you. Now, tonight's conversation will be guided by Rabbi Josh Fagelson, President and CEO of IJS. Josh is the author of Eternal Questions, Reflections, Conversations, and Jewish Mindfulness Practices for the weekly Torah portion, published by Ben Yehuda Press, and he is the host of Soulful Jewish Living, Mindful Practices for Every Day. Joining Josh tonight is Rabbi Shai Held. Shai is president, dean, and chair in Jewish thought at the Hadar Institute. He received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education. He has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. Rabbi Held is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, and The Heart of Torah. His new book, Judaism is About Love, is out now from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. You can purchase Shai's book using the link in the chat. You are encouraged to ask questions during tonight's event. Please address your questions to Q&A in the chat. And now over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It's really great to be here with everybody and to be here with Shai. Wonderful. We're getting the pictures all set. Fantastic. So Shai, welcome. It is great to be with you and to be able to have this conversation, and we've been looking forward to it for a long time. And the book is here, and as I showed Shai earlier, very well marked and dog-eared and everything. It is a book that I have engaged with a lot, that I imagine a lot of people are engaging with a lot as they read it. So really encourage everybody to get a copy and read it for yourself. Shai, the title of this book, I think you couldn't have picked a more obvious argument in the title. You know exactly what this book is about. The title of the book is its central argument, that Judaism is about love. I think you approach that thesis as a kind of truth that I think has become obscured or minimized over the centuries, and you're trying to reclaim it. And I'm really curious to hear about what led you to write the book now and why you think that argument is so important now.
Thanks, Josh, and it's wonderful to be here. I have had a series of experiences over the course of my career that have sort of shocked me in terms of the extent to which many Jews, even knowledgeable, caring, passionate Jews, have internalized traditional Christian anti-Jewish ideas. I opened this book with a story that I've been sharing a lot, but it was so formative for me. I was speaking to a group of fifth-year students at a major American Jewish seminary, and I said in passing, kind of just like in a discussion, Judaism is the story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. And one of the rabbinical students in the class said, "I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me." And I was, taken aback and a little heartbroken in that moment. And I said to him, it's so interesting that you say that. But in fact, I was thinking about the morning and evening Jewish liturgy, in which we say, Ahava Rabbah Ahavtanu, with vast love have you loved us. And then a moment later we say, V'ahavta et Hashem Elohecha, and you should love the Lord your God. In other words, a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. If that makes you think of Christianity, then we have a tremendous amount of work to do in kind of undoing the way we've internalized the story that's been told about us. And I've gotten interested in recent years, not that I have expertise in this, in the whole idea that minority communities tend to begin to see themselves the way the majority community sees them, the internalization of prejudice. And Jews were, after all, a religious and an ethnic minority for thousands of years. And in some sense in America very much still are. So I think that is, one piece. And what I was really struck by over the years is that this is a kind of internalized prejudice that cuts across denominational lines. I have heard this from Reform rabbinical students. I have heard this from students in Hesder Yeshivot in Israel. I have heard it all over the place. This idea, Judaism is about love. That's not what Judaism's about. So that's one piece. And then I also wanted to write a book for Christians who, there are so many Christians out there who know that the way Judaism has been portrayed to them is obsolete and offensive, but they really have no idea what to put in its place. This is a conversation I've had with various professors at Christian seminaries. And so the secondary audience for this book was, I'm trying to offer Christians a different way of thinking and talking about what Judaism is. Why this book is so important to me is, at the end of the day, the subtitle of the book is Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life. And I mean heart there in both senses of the word, heart meaning the core. How can you have a Judaism in which ikar chaser min hasefer, in which the very essence is missing, right? When you don't talk about love. And also the heart, in the sense of Judaism is very much a religion of the heart. Rachmana liba bai, the Talmud says, right? The merciful one desires the human heart. So I just feel it's a really important project of reclamation and restoration, of sort of bringing back to the heart of Judaism what has always belonged there.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about, the dual audiences, it sounds like, for the book, right? this is a very Jewy book. There's 100 pages of endnotes, and lots of citations to both traditional Jewish sources, Jewish philosophy, Jewish text, Talmud, Bible, etc., Jewish thinkers, as well as a lot of Christian theologians, philosophers, and others, right? And it's not published by a Jewish publisher; it's published by Farrar Straus, right? And Giroux. Let us not forget Giroux. Right. So. I'm curious about, and there's a question, please direct your questions to Q&A, but there's a good question that did somehow get directed to me directly from someone who's a Roman Catholic on here, and asking a little bit more about, on the one hand, you're saying there's an audience here for Jews who have internalized messages over millennia, right, that have become cultural memes that we've imbibed. But also, I wonder within the Christian world, what are you hoping the book does there? What's the conversation that you hope it prompts, or that you'd like to engage in, or maybe you're already engaged in within the Christian world?
Yeah, I mean, I've been spending a bunch of time the last couple of weeks, both recording Christian podcasts and visiting Christian seminaries, which has been really, really interesting. I think that, how do I say this in a very sort of straightforward way? Traditional Christian anti-Judaism has actually led not just to a distorted view of Judaism, but a distorted view of Christianity, and actually an inability to understand what wells Jesus drank from. So here's an example of this, another experience that I had that I don't write about in the book, but I now regret that I didn't. I was speaking to a group of 20 high school students, all of whom identify as Protestant, whatever that might mean. Obviously there's a huge range in there. And again, kind of in passing, I asked, remind me, what does Jesus say is the great command? All 20 hands go up. I call on someone. He tells me love of God and love of neighbor. And then I say totally innocently, and remind me, what is Jesus quoting? Not a single hand goes up. This is 1999. Not a single hand goes up. The answer, by the way, is Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? And I think it is to build a religious identity on denigrating another person's religious identity is not yet to achieve a certain kind of spiritual maturity. And I think many Christians in the contemporary world understand that. I often quote, I had a conversation with a friend of mine named Patricia Lyons, who is a professor at an Episcopal seminary. And Patricia said to me that her alums regularly say things to her like, I know I can't preach what I learned about Judaism in seminary. I know I can't say those things. I know I have to say other things, but I have no idea what they are. And her comment to me was, I'm looking forward to handing out your book to all those students. I was very moved by that. Obviously, it's a very humbling thought. If I can contribute in some small way to a Christian reimagining of Judaism and of Christianity's relationship to Judaism. But that's sort of what I'm after. Now, obviously, the Christian world, like the Jewish one, is just incredibly diverse. And the Christians who are engaging with me are somewhat self-selected, right? They are, Catholic colleges that are interested in Catholic-Jewish relations, Christian seminaries that are interested in Jewish studies, right? There's obviously big swaths of the Christian world that will never hear of this book, and are not interested in what it has to say. But I've been very moved by how many people actually have been interested. And it's striking to me when I record these podcasts that the interviewers are very different. Some are unequivocally evangelical, some are mainline Protestants, some are Catholic theologians. They have their own religious and theological projects, but they are united by a sense that they have to learn to think differently about Judaism. And in some instances, which I find really interesting, by a desire to repent. I mean, just the other day, I was speaking at Boston College, and a professor of Catholic ethics there, who I really admire, Steve Pope, said, and it kind of honestly took me aback. He said, I hope all Christians read this book as an act of penance for the bloodshed of which we've been guilty. And I mean, that's a very intense thing to say. And, if I can contribute in the smallest way to that, that's, ma tov, that's beautiful and wonderful.
Wow. That's a very powerful statement. it strikes me in as I'm listening to this, I've been thinking a lot. Early in the book, you talk about the influence of Yitz Greenberg on you, and I'm going to go off script for a second, but you and I are both Talmidim of Yitz. We're both very have been very shaped by him as a teacher, and it strikes me that Yitz. There's times I was reading this book and I was thinking to myself, okay, Shai is building on his Heschel work, right? Like there's a natural sort of development progression from, okay, you wrote a book about Heschel, that was your doctoral dissertation, became a book, and that, right? And yet, I also like in hearing in what you were just saying, also there are like such deep Greenbergian roots here to the project of interfaith dialogue and post-Shoah, especially. And I wonder, you mentioned Yitz early in the book, and build on him a little bit there, but I wonder, I'm personally now interested, and I hope the rest of the audience will come along with me for a second on this little journey. I just wonder how you see this as related to Yitz's own teaching, and how you see, and obviously he's now also in a really amazing way a colleague of yours at Hadar, but I'm just curious about that. I'd like to invite you to reflect on it.
Yeah, thank you for that. You not surprisingly named probably the two biggest intellectual and spiritual influences on my life in talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel and Yitz Greenberg. Thich Nhat Hanh is in there too, but that's a different discussion.
We're at IJS. We'll get to Thich Nhat Hanh. Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay. So here's an interesting thing that Yitz has been saying in recent years that maybe he said all along, but I don't remember hearing him say. In this book, just to sort of bring everyone along for what we're talking about, I talk in one of the chapters about Yitz's preoccupation with the notion of human dignity and infinite worth. And one of the things Yitz has started saying, or at least I've started noticing him saying a lot, is this question of where does this dignity stem from? What is the origin of the dignity? And he's been arguing in ways I find very moving that human dignity is rooted in divine love, that it is God's love that bestows dignity upon us. That is, I think, one of the interesting ways in which implicitly my project is a kind of, I don't know what you want to say, taking to a next step of his project, a kind of development. I make no secret of my profound indebtedness, and actually I'm very grateful. That's what it means, right? To both Heschel and Yitz for the ways that their influence goes far beyond the places where they're cited in the book. I mean, I would not be the person I am, or the thinker I am, or the teacher I am without Yitz. But it's interesting to me how he has started talking about love. I was actually at a seminar recently in which Arna Pupko-Fischer asked him, is this a case of the student reflecting back to the teacher, did you used to talk about love this much? Or is that like, you're very proud of Shai, you have a very strong relationship, and so it's now you've taken it on board. I honestly have to say, I don't even remember what he said in response because I was so kind of taken aback by the question. I suspect that it was there all along and that it's become more accentuated over time. I think if I could be this bold, as Yitz has become older, he's also become much gentler and willing to talk about emotion in a certain way that was maybe harder for him when I remember him from 35 years ago. And so I think things that were kind of in germinal form in his thinking are now very much out there at the surface. And I'm actually thrilled anytime there's a convergence. And it wouldn't surprise me if it was a greater influence than I even realized.
Yeah, which is also something that we were talking about the Jew and the Lotus earlier, and which involves both Yitz and Reb Zalman, right, the two main characters in that book. And of course, Reb Zalman would point out that when as we age, physically we might be more diminished cognitively, we might start to be more diminished spiritually. We're like we're blossoming, right? That's right. Actually when so. fascinating. That's a conversation I'll have to have with Yitz. I want to go to something in the book where let's shift over to specifically about spirituality. And I'll read here. You offered a definition of a spiritual life, where you say a spiritual life is to seek to grow in love and kindness, and to persevere even when love as a perfect integration of emotion and action seems daunting or out of reach. And I'll repeat that. This is a definition, Shai's definition of a spiritual life, to seek to grow in love and kindness, and to persevere even when love as a perfect integration of emotion and action seems daunting or out of reach. So I'm struck by a few things about that sentence. First is the absence of intellect from that. And I'm wondering where the mind and thought fits into that. Obviously, it is not absent, but it is striking, right? Second, the emphasis is not on commandedness or on duty, but on chesed, right? And I'm especially interested in that point because you and I think, both come from an orientation of mitzvah means commandment. And you spend a lot of the book, I think, talking about fulfilling responsibilities and obligations out of love. Yet I imagine for some or even many of the people here, right, on an IJS call, that's not necessarily an orientation to mitzvot that they share. I've talked to some of our many, some of our most stalwart people, and they're like, yeah, that's not the approach to mitzvah I have. They start with an approach to mitzvah that is less about commandment and more in the mystical and Hasidic sort of approach, mitzvah as tzavta, as connection, as expression of divine love. So my question, which I'm going to formulate a little more provocatively than maybe it deserves to be, is like, what's the chiddush, right? What is the for folks who see the title of this book and say, of course Judaism is about love. I wonder how you would respond to, like, how do you understand the message of the book for someone who's coming with that orientation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Josh, it seems like actually in that was a series of about 7 or 8 different questions, all of which would make for a rich discussion. So if I can, maybe what I'll do is I'll just sort of pick up on threads of it and hopefully.
Yes, it was not the most concise question. So pick up on
No, but it was a great, and right. I mean, the questions flow into each other. So let me try to say a couple of things about this. First of all, I wanted to start with your interesting observation about what you call the absence of intellect. I would answer this in 2 ways. One of which is, I think that probably to a fault, at times I am rebelling against the side of life in yeshiva that I found barren, a side that was hyper-intellectualist and not focused on the human heart at all. That is certainly not all that I experienced in yeshiva, but it is an aspect of yeshiva culture. And in many ways, I wanted to show that the tradition itself offers very powerful correctives to that. I wasn't importing them from elsewhere. I was drawing on the resources of tradition to emphasize just how central the heart is, and in particular, just how central love is. That said, I would also say, and I don't know if we want to go down this kind of philosophical rabbit hole, I'm very much of the approach that emotions are themselves cognitive. I think emotions involve the intellect. The whole notion of the heart being totally separable from the mind is something I don't find persuasive at all anymore. And I think philosophically, that's kind of the conversation in moral theory has moved away from that. So when I talk about integration of emotion and action, implicitly the mind is very much part of that conversation. And yet you're right to point out that I talk about, emotion and action, and I don't talk about, say, intellection, cognition, whatever it might be. So I think the point is really interesting, and I have to think about it more, but I think it stems from what I felt I was trying to correct, and also how I think about what an emotion is. Now, about the question that you ended with about sort of chesed and duty. So one of the things that I wanted to argue in this book implicitly, I say it in a few places explicitly, but I argue it implicitly, is that the dichotomization between duty and desire is ultimately one that is quite damaging from a Jewish spiritual perspective. The example of this that I often think about, it just helps me orient. So when I think about giving breakfast to my own kids, am I doing that because I'm obligated to, or am I doing that because I want to? The answer is probably some yes. I'm doing both of those things. It's not desire or obligation. It's desire and obligation. So do I call a close friend when they're struggling with depression because I have to or because I want to? Well, that's exactly what I do. And it's both of them are true at the same time and operative at the same time. So what you have, I mean, the way that you framed it, Josh, I think is like you have a kind of traditionalist frame that starts with obligation and then wants to carve out a space for desire or free will, right? Or love. And then you have a more liberal orientation that starts with love and freedom and then has to figure out what space it has for duty and obligation. I'm trying to walk a path here of insisting that those two things actually go hand in hand, which I think at moments at least become explicit in the Jewish tradition. And those moments are really rich to me and quite interesting, right? I mean, do we serve God because it's a mitzvah or do we serve God because it's tzavta? Well, yeah.
Right. That comes to mind, there's a Robert Bringhurst poem that he talks about whether the demons work from inside out or outside in, and that's the one theological question, right? And you're asking, I think, a version of this question, and I really appreciate your formulation. It's not there's a false dichotomy, right, that maybe has been constructed as maybe over the course of the Enlightenment, and you would be in a better position to answer this question than me, but like in the creation of a modern subject and modern subjectivity, there's a very firm push away from obligation, right, towards volition, and everything is volitional, and I'm only going to do it because I want to. When in fact, as you're saying, nothing is very few things, and perhaps nothing is strictly one or the other, right? It's always some combination of the two.
And for whatever it's worth, I mean, I also think that obligation is constitutive of what it even means to be a self. For some of us, that might not be clear, or it might not be theological, but I think on some level intuitively we all know that, right? Part of what it means to be a self is to know that other people's suffering makes a claim on me. And to me, that's really essential. I don't think you can forget about Judaism for a minute. I'm not sure you can have a coherent notion of selfhood without some kind of discourse around an experience of obligation.
Yeah.
So I would, in that sense, I guess I'm pushing back against a certain kind of modernist liberalism. And, from a more traditional perspective, I mean, for some folks that might be, Levinas might be a useful way for thinking about this, if it's, this kind of where the theology is really in the service of ethics for him. But I don't think we can bypass obligation. And I think it's a mistake to try and do so, not least because it's not true to my sense of all of our experience. Right? We all have some experience of obligation, even if we name it differently, even if we understand its origins differently. But there's no real spiritual life or moral life without obligation. That doesn't mean the Shulchan Aruch necessarily, but it
right. So maybe there's a segue into this question from that. I'm just going to segue into it and we'll see if it works. But you wrote this book, obviously, I think you told me you've been working on this for the better part of the last 7 years. And so it's time for a sabbatical, obviously. And after the book tour. But you wrote this book before October 7th, 2023. I remember in the days after October 7th, you reading a Facebook post from you, where it was sort of a cri de coeur of like, if this doesn't cause you to question your prior assumptions, like what does cause you to question your prior assumptions? Like for everybody, no matter where you stand. And as time has gone on since then, and the situation has become, what it is, the whatever we can call it. I wonder, now the book is coming out. I wonder um, how is the book different in your mind, or how is talking about the book different, or how's the message of the book different? How has that evolved, or how are you thinking about it differently as a result of the last 6 months, which are, we're still living in this unfolding new moment in Jewish history?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. I think maybe I'll start by sharing very personally that the galleys of the book arrived at my home on Saturday morning, October 14th. And I looked at my wife when the box arrived. I went out and I brought the box in, and I said to my wife, I have no interest in this book at all. None. This book I am totally numb to any discussion in this book. And it took me, no exaggeration, about 4 days to actually open the box. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I just felt what I was feeling was a kind of crushing sadness, honestly, some anger that was like very intense, and a sense of despair. And then something really interesting happened, which is that I started sharing with some students and colleagues that I was feeling indifference and apathy towards my book. And almost to a head, people kept saying to me, you have this exactly backwards. I want to talk about love more now than I ever have in my life. And I have to be honest and say, I was not there. I heard people saying it, and I was just like, that's not how I feel right now. All I am is devastated. And to be totally honest, I'm still not totally there. I'm more open to it now, but I'm still not totally there. But it occurred to me after a few weeks of these conversations that people were tapping into whether or not they knew it or not, they were tapping into a kind of rich vein of Jewish tradition, which is the idea that we respond to devastation with a defiant insistence on more love. And the example of this that I try to develop in the book that has become very important to me over the course of my life is that if you think about Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, as a day of utter devastation, everything horrible that happened to the Jews happened on that day. We are mourning the temples. We are mourning not arriving in the land. We are mourning every possible catastrophe. And then before Shiva is even over, it's Tu B'Av, it's the 15th of Av, and the Mishnah says, just two Mishnayot after the one that talks about Tisha B'Av, the Mishnah says, there were no happier days in Israel than Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur, because that's when people would meet and couple off. And I remember the first time I read that Mishnah, I was like, that's just bizarre. Shiva is not even over for the biggest catastrophe you can imagine, and people are going off and, meeting each other in a romance. And over the years, I came to realize that that is a kind of a rabbinic act of defiance. It says, at a moment of destruction, when it seems that all is lost, there is still the possibility of love. There is still the possibility of renewed human connection. Trauma closes us off in so many ways. It kind of constricts us physically and emotionally. And Tu B'Av says, how about love? And I want to underscore, it says how about love in a particular way, because the Mishnah ends by talking about how the women of Israel would go out wearing white robes that they borrowed so as not to embarrass those who couldn't afford their own white robe. And what that made me understand is that the Mishnah is also saying, I think, it's not just about the love between couples, which can just become a glorified form of selfishness. It's actually the kind of love between couples that opens them and awakens them to the vulnerability of the community around them, including those who tend to live on the margins and not be seen, those who are poor. And when these folks kept saying to me, I want to talk about love now, what I realized was that they were kind of tapping into the logic of the Mishnah that said, yeah, it feels like everything that we believed in is gone right now, and we will respond by loving one another and developing an even deeper ethical sensitivity to those who live on the edges of our society, those who we tend to treat as invisible. That is just very, very moving to me, even as I find it very hard to access a lot of the time in my own life, in these few months. I mean, I think there are other things here that I would say that are important to me. One is that there is nothing wrong and even something right with, in a moment of tragedy, having your first response be desire to hold your family close. I don't think that is something to apologize for at all. And compassion is almost never a vice, and dehumanization is always a crime, right? As I emphasize at great length in chapter 7, like the temptation to dehumanize people who do horrific things is just very dangerous, because when you dehumanize people who do horrific things, you end up granting yourself license to do horrific things in the same vein. And so we have to really struggle. And that is true regardless of whether you think Israel's war is a just war, an unjust war, whatever your just war approach to all this is, that compassion and the resistance of dehumanization is utterly essential. And the last thing I think I would say about this is that, it seems so far away right now, but at the end of the day, the only way that Eretz Yisrael will become less blood-soaked, it seems to me, is if the two peoples who love it so much decide to approach one another with empathy and with a willingness to hear one another's stories and sorrows. Anything short of that is not going to get us there. I often think about, I'm sorry if this is a long-winded response, but I often think about a speech given by Moshe Una, who was this is in itself an interesting evolution of religious Zionism. He was a member of Knesset from the National Religious Party and the founder of the Religious Zionist Peace Movement. Just sort of put that in your mind for a second, right? The NRP, which is now so right-wing, Una was an old-fashioned lefty in a certain way. But he has this wonderful speech. He was an educator by training, and he talks about chinuch lamoledet, about what it means to educate kids to embrace their Jewish heritage. And the first part is quite conventional, what you might expect. He says, we are entrusted with a duty to teach our kids about loving this land, loving the history, loving the experience, loving the commandments, everything that we associate with this glorious, wondrous, beautiful place. That's what chinuch lamoledet is. And then he says, but there's another dimension of chinuch lamoledet, and that is that we have to instill in our kids an awareness that there is another people who have the same feelings that we do.
Hmm.
Somehow, without that, we'll just keep doing this for another 100 years.
Yeah.
And I just, I think that at the end of the day, the willingness to see other people in their humanity is really, really hard and really, really integral to any kind of peace anywhere, really, but certainly there.
Yeah, that I mean, I was in a conversation yesterday. I was on a panel, and he said it publicly, so I don't think he'll mind me invoking it here. And he's a friend of ours, both Dan Liebenson, with Dan, and who had been in Israel recently. We were talking about we both have siblings who live in Israel. We have lots, many connections. And what we both hear from a lot of people is still, even 6 months later, I just don't feel like I can summon, from Jewish Israelis, I don't feel like I can summon any empathy, for Gazans, for Palestinians. And what Dan said, Dan's a provocative thinker. He said, I feel like that's just, Judaism has failed at that point. Like, if isn't the whole point that, like, you might feel this way, to go back to our obligation conversation, you might feel that way. And yet the Torah comes to tell you, right, that even when you feel that way, you need to somehow access something else. Now, and it's not saying it's a failure on the part of the people who are experiencing their own trauma and their own, I've heard people refer to it as the halachic status of aninut, that status when you have someone who's died and you haven't buried them yet, and where you're basically just kind of detached almost. And yet, the message that you're I'll say it feels even it feels provocative and a little dangerous for me to even say this out loud here. But what is so provocative and so dangerous about the message that you just offered, right? I mean, yes, of course it's about compassion. Of course it's about love, and and yes, you can be fighting a just war. But what is the ethos with which that is imbued? And maybe that's what those of us who are on this side of the ocean who are not directly traumatized by the events, we need to be the spokespeople for that we can articulate that out loud. But it was just very striking to hear him say that, and it sounds somewhat similar to I think what you're saying.
Yeah, I think what I would say, since this is, after all, IJS, I think something that I would want to sort of throw in here is that the challenge becomes how not to just condemn those people who don't live up to our standards of empathy, but actually how to have empathy for why empathy is so inaccessible to so many people right now.
Right.
And actually the way to deal with our own internal voices that refuse empathy is to be empathic towards them. Right. In other words, there's no bypassing this very hard work. You don't get a pass. It reminds me of, I remember I had a professor in college who was obsessed with religious pluralism, but I always felt like they were totally focused on pluralism to other pluralists. But when it came to people who were not pluralists, she had no room for them. And so it's like, I think we have to be very careful about not saying, if Judaism is to succeed, and I know this is not what Dan is saying, and just to be clear, but, if Dan is not saying, how do I say this? If empathy is hard to access right now, and that represents a failure, then the real posture, I think, towards people we see is a kind of loving curiosity that says, what's blocking this right now? That is so much more helpful than, you're a spiritual and moral failure. I mean, that's a lot of the culture that we live in right now. And I think we ought to really work hard to resist that, to see, to be committed to seeing the pain of people we don't agree with.
Rabbi Sheila Weinberg, one of our founding teachers, has a line that we quote a lot at IJS, which is, reminder not to judge other people for being failed versions of you.
Right.
It's a wonderful teaching. This is a book that's very rich in ideas and arguments. And yet I found one of the most moving passages in the book, the one in which you describe what you tell your children at night before bedtime. I don't know if you have the book in front of you, but I would just invite you to read that. I think it's on page 90, because this is really good. It's the bottom paragraph on my page 90 anyway.
Okay.
We have loving children.
Okay, here goes. Every few weeks, before I put my children to bed, I tell them some version of the following. I love you so much. You really can't even imagine how much I love you. I barely even understand it myself. But there's something else I want you to know. As much as I love you, God loves you so much more than that. I can't even begin to fathom how much God loves you. I say this to them in part because I am only too keenly aware of my own shortcomings. I have no doubt that there will be moments when I will communicate to them, whether I mean to or not, that my love for them is conditional, that they have to earn, or worse, buy my love. And I want them to know in those moments that no matter how bad I make them feel or how deeply I hurt them, they are loved by an inexhaustible source of love who loves them more profoundly and more unconditionally than I as a human being ever could.
It was such a moving. I mean, you're a beautiful writer, first of all, but that passage I just found so moving on a couple of levels. One was just the content of it itself, but also the in this book that is very is a lot of arguments, a lot of ideas, this is one of the anecdotes and one of the practices that to me like really stands out, is like this, you're giving us, okay, I read that and I was like, oh, that's a good practice that I could actually use with my own children, right? That's an idea. And I think, Shai, one of the big things about our what we do at IJS, I think, is this emphasis on Torah not only as ideas, but Torah as practice, right? Torah is things that we do. And I'm wondering, I mean, and I know we correspond a little bit about this beforehand, and maybe you thought about it in the days since, but I'm wondering for you, what are other if there is another practice or two in your own life that you find for yourself are just ways that are that you cultivate, that you nurture a sense of an awareness of God's love in you, or a sense that Judaism is about love in you and for others, for your students, for your children, for other people.
Yeah. It's interesting. So let me say first something about a common Jewish practice that I talk about briefly in the book, which is a great example of how something can become rote and lose all of its power. And yet when we stop and let ourselves hear it again, it's actually, I think, startling in its kind of wake-up call. Waking up in the morning and having the very first word that we utter be grateful is extremely moving. And one of the things that I talk about is that we don't say ani modeh, I am grateful, or ani modah, rather modeh or modah ani, grateful am I. And whatever the Hebrew grammar people will say about why that might be, I find it really interesting that we say, I am grateful even before I have a self. Before I can even say I am already embedded in a series of relationships with God, with others. It's like a very different way of imagining selfhood. I always like to say, I'd like to say this to people who are weirdos like myself, that, Modani is a critique of Descartes, right? Instead of sort of saying, when I strip it all down, what I know, the only thing I'm certain of is I, right? The Modani is saying, actually, when I strip it all down, the only thing I'm aware of is how grateful and indebted I am. How I couldn't be here without other people doing all kinds of things to make that possible. I often quote this line that is attributed to Mark Twain, although sadly it's pretty clear he didn't say it. A self-made man is like a self-laid egg. I totally love that quote. Because the illusion that we're self-made is the opposite of modani and is the opposite of Jewish spirituality. So on a good day, even in years of my life when I was meditating and doing yoga, I still found the moment of opening my eyes and saying modeh to be unbelievably challenging, moving, grounding, a lot of things at once. And then I want to give you what is at once a very frum and perhaps subversive practice that is very, very important in my own life and very much related to Modeh Ani. Reciting Kiddush on Friday night is a moment for me of stopping and fully inhabiting an awareness that I did not create myself, and I did not create the world that I inhabit. And, to use my language for a minute, my life is a gift, the world is a gift, my life in the world is a gift within a gift. And Shabbat Kiddush is really about that. And yes, for me, it's very traditionally theological. It's about a creator. But I think there are probably ways in which other people with other theologies can sort of appropriate, make their own, this practice of, Shabbat, it's actually the world was not made by us. Hu asanu v'lo anachnu. God made us and not we ourselves. The cultivation of that awareness. In that sense, I guess Modeh Ani and Shabbat Kiddush are very much a pair in my mind. Yeah. Of beginning with a sense of how much I've been given. And, I'll say, since some people on this call know this, as someone who lives with pretty debilitating and at times crushing chronic illness, the practice of acknowledging how much I've been given is actually quite liberating. I can see where it can also be daunting and feel alien, but it's very important to me, given all the opportunities that I don't have that other people do, to also be aware of how blessed I am. That's like a very important spiritual work for me. And I am not a saint. There are times when it is very, very hard for me, but it is very much an aspiration. Like, all the more so can I find ways to tap into gratitude for the gifts of life and consciousness.
That's probably a very good place for us to stop, I think. This has been such a very, very rich conversation. The good news is you can hear Shai all over the place. We're privileged to have him here now for this conversation, but he's got a large speaking tour that you can find on the Hadar website. I know we can put the link again in the chat. The book is Judaism is About Love, Reclaiming the Heart of Jewish Life. Shai, this was such a great conversation. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here, and thank you for writing the book and sharing it with the world.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Okay, Miriam, back to you.
Thank you so much, Josh and Shai. What a gift and a blessing, and what a moving conversation. I also want to thank Rachel Huguet, Maydell Goodman Ben-Ami, and Molly Easton for assisting in this evening's program. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. Please plan to join us again on May 15th, when Josh will be in conversation with Rabbi Sharon Brous. May you all have a very blessed evening. Thank you so much.
We are made from love. Love is sustaining us. We are worthy of being loved. We are love.